In a remote part of the world, in a small, dusty village on the edge of a vast forest, lived an old man named Hugga. The years had slowed his steps and turned his hair gray, but his heart was still full of life and energy. Every day, he spent his time walking through the village, feeding the birds or tending to the flowers in his garden. He was content, but he knew he lacked companionship with others. One day, when the sky darkened and the wind whistled through the trees, he heard a strange sound near his garden. At first, he thought it was an animal, but as he approached, he saw a young woman standing at the edge of the forest. She was unlike anyone else in the village. Her skin glowed with a pale, almost silvery hue, and her eyes were a bright blue. Her name was Lyra, and she was on a journey in search of a safe haven. Lyra explained to Hugga that she was on a long and dangerous journey, and that continuing at night was too risky for her. Hugga, though noticing her unusual appearance, was a kind man. Without hesitation, he invited her into his home. A warm bed and some food won't hurt, he thought. Lyra was grateful, and in the hours that followed, they sat by the fire and talked about the places she had seen. But Hugga didn't know that Lyra was not just a traveler. She belonged to an alien species, and at that very moment, she was in the midst of her reproductive phase. For her kind, this was a special time when her needs were far more intense than usual. Lyra had learned to control her desires, or so she thought. But as she began to converse with Hugga, she felt a strange attraction growing between them. Hugga, unsure of himself, found it odd how Lyra suddenly seemed so close. Her touches were barely fleeting, and her gazes were long and intense. Her voice, soft and gentle, had a calming effect on him. But there was also something undefined that stirred him. Lyra couldn't help but feel this tension. It seemed her body began to come alive near him, and the impulses of her species demanded more. "Sorry, I didn't mean to," Lyra whispered as her hand accidentally brushed against him. Her heart was pounding, and she realized she was losing control of the situation. Hugga, however, oblivious, simply smiled and said, "Don't worry, girl. Sometimes closeness brings us together." But at that moment, Hugga was captivated not only by her appearance, but also by the intense aura radiating from her. In the hours that followed, the atmosphere between them remained tense and electric. Hugga noticed how Lyra kept glancing at him, as if trying to gauge his reaction if she came even closer. Hugga didn't know what to do. Something inside him was pulling him. But the old man was also cautious not to give in to the desires of such a young and enchanting woman. Lyra knew she couldn't wait any longer. Her needs were beginning to overwhelm her. There was no other place she could find shelter, and Hugga was now the only person who could help her. Her instincts urged her to act, and she could no longer resist the tempting thoughts swirling in her head. Hugga, barely understanding his own desires, found himself in a similar situation, torn between curiosity and caution. He didn't know what to do when Lyra approached him. "Hugga," she said softly, looking him straight in the eyes, "I need something from you. Can you help me calm this inner restlessness?" Her words carried a meaning that was not easy to decipher, but Hugga, who in his loneliness had never received such a request, couldn't resist what emanated from her. The tension between them became so thick it was almost palpable. Hugga felt himself being pulled into a whirlpool with no way out. Lyra knew she was doing something risky, but she could no longer control it. She needed more, much more than Hugga could imagine. As the night deepened and the hours dragged on, the line between hospitality and something entirely different became almost indistinguishable. The stories they told each other merged with unspoken desires that hung in the air. Hugga still didn't know what exactly he needed to do, but the desire Lyra had awakened in him was impossible to ignore. Lyra felt the same. That night, anything seemed possible, and in her eyes, Hugga saw that nothing would ever be the same again. The rest of the night passed in a haze of unspoken words and secret desires. But both of them knew that this moment would change everything forever. As the night continued, Hugga found himself sinking deeper into the whirlpool of this strange situation. He noticed how Lyra became more decisive in her movements. her body practically sparking with an intense, almost electric energy that Hoga could neither anticipate nor understand. He didn't know that Lyra was like a magnet to him, as if her existence on this earth was meant to pull him out of his familiar loneliness and draw him into a world of unexplored desires. Hoga felt both overwhelmed by this new, almost supernatural attraction and filled with curiosity and childlike wonder. What could happen, he thought to himself, quietly laughing as he sank into a silent yet captivating conversation with Lyra, which was becoming more absurd than he had ever expected. "You know," Hoga said with a wink, "I've seen so many strange things in my life, but you, my dear, are something else." Lyra, her eyes glowing in the dark, tilted her head and looked at him with a mix of curiosity and slight irony. "Oh, you haven't seen anything yet, Hoga. Believe me, what you think is strange is quite normal for me." She took a step closer, and Hoga noticed how her scent enveloped him again. A mix of exotic flowers and something he couldn't name. A blend of freedom and temptation. "You talk a lot, but you don't really understand what I need," she whispered, and in her voice was that seductive tone that made Hoga feel like he was in a dream. He laughed nervously again, unsure how to respond to her words. But then it occurred to him that he had never experienced such tension in his life. Was this a trick, or had she truly stumbled upon his home by chance? "You know, Lyra," Hoga began, "most people my age would find all this, how should I put it, impolite." Lyra merely smirked and stepped closer, her movements smooth and unyielding. "Really?" she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. Hoga felt a chill run down his spine. "I hope you're not the type to run at the first opportunity, are you?" she asked with a mischievous smile. Hoga could hardly believe his ears. Was this actually flirting that had just happened, or was it just a strange misunderstanding? "I'm just an old man," he muttered, trying nervously to gather his thoughts. But Lyra laughed softly. "Oh, Hoga," she said, sitting on the couch near the fireplace. "Old men are known for their wisdom, right? But I wonder how wise you really are." She leaned back, her fingers playing with one of the pillows, and Hoga noticed a glint in her eyes, a mix of curiosity and a strange challenge. "You're not as innocent as you pretend to be, are you?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. Hoga suddenly felt a wave of confusion. What did she really want? What did he want? And what on earth was happening here? "Well, I think everyone has their secrets," Hoga quickly replied, trying to regain his composure. "But sometimes you just have to let go." Lyra nodded in agreement. "Yes," she said, "sometimes you just have to let go. Control isn't always about understanding everything." She stood up and moved closer to him, her steps sounding like the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. Hoga could barely breathe as she took another step closer. The tension between them was almost unbearable. At that moment, he realized he would never again be the old man in his village. Something in him had changed, and he wasn't sure if it was for better or worse. "What do you want, Hoga?" Lyra asked in a voice that sounded almost like a command. "You know what I want. I want you to come with me. No questions asked. I want you to share this moment with me. Maybe it's the last moment we'll have." Her hand rested on his chest, and Hoga felt the beating of her heart. He felt the warmth in her that was pulling him more and more. Something in him knew that this meeting wasn't a coincidence. It seemed as if the universe had created this strange connection to test them both. However, Hoga, who in recent years had never shown his emotions, felt himself slowly losing control. "But Lyra, what if I can't follow you? What if I don't know what you really need?" he asked quietly, his voice full of uncertainty. Lyra only smiled mysteriously and shook her head. "You don't need to know what I need, Hoga," she whispered. "You only need to know what you want." Her gaze met his, and at that moment, it seemed as if the whole world stood still. Hoga could no longer think clearly, and yet he knew that this night had awakened something in him that he had never thought possible. Now, the question wasn't whether he should give in to the situation, but how deeply he wanted to dive into this unexplored world. "Is there no way back?" Hoga asked, feeling time shift around him. Lyra smirked and placed a finger on his lips. "There's no way back," she whispered, leaning closer to him. And as their lips almost touched, Hugga realized he had reached a point of no return. At that moment, time seemed to slow down as Hugga and Lyra stood in silence, charged with tension. Their bodies were so close that the air around them was almost electric. Hugga felt his heart beating faster as Lyra, with a mysterious smile, looked into his eyes. "You really are a special person, Hugga," she said softly, running her finger along his arm. Her touch was gentle, but Hugga felt a hidden desire emanating from her, a mix of curiosity and temptation he couldn't fully escape. "You never expected this, did you?" Lyra asked, leaning a little closer. "Not in my wildest dreams," Hugga muttered, trying to pull himself together. But it was difficult. Lyra's presence had something that threw him off balance. Her aura was almost hypnotic, and the way she looked at him made it hard for him to breathe. But as he tried to focus on the conversation, he noticed how her hand slowly slid along his arm, barely touching, almost playfully, as if she were playing a secret game with him. "What if I told you you're not as innocent as you think?" she whispered, her voice sweet but full of challenge. Hugga looked at her, unsure whether to take her words seriously or if it was just another joke. But Lyra seemed serious. Her eyes sparkled, and she moved even closer to him. "I know you're starting to understand something, Hugga," she said, watching his reaction. "There are things you haven't experienced yet, things you don't even realize could attract you." Hugga tried to organize his thoughts, but his inner doubts were overwhelmed by an inexplicable excitement. What if she was right? What if he really saw more in her than he wanted to admit? "You're a strange person, Hugga," she said with a mischievous smile, standing up and slightly moving away from him. But then she turned back to him. Her eyes sparkled with determination. "But that's exactly what you need. Someone to show you that you're much more than you ever thought. You see yourself as an old man, as someone who can no longer experience anything new. But what if I told you that life is much more exciting when you share it with the right people?" Her words hung in the air, and Hugga felt a wave of desire and uncertainty wash over him. She had thrown him a challenge, and he knew there was no turning back. "You're different from what I expected," he finally said, trying to regain control. "I thought you were just an ordinary traveler, but you've led me in a direction I didn't know." Lyra smiled as if she knew exactly what was going on in his head. "That's the point, Hugga," she said. "Sometimes you need to step away from what you know and dive into the unknown. That's what you did tonight, and you won't regret it. You're no longer the old man you were." Her voice became firm, and Hugga saw her sinking into her own thoughts. "You really are an extraordinary person," Lyra continued, slowly circling him. Her movements were smooth, almost hypnotic, and Hugga couldn't take his eyes off her. She continued to captivate him, as if she knew he was the key to something greater. "And you have much more potential than you've ever allowed yourself. You can regain control, Hugga, but for that, you need to trust me." Her voice became almost a whisper as she came very close to him. Hugga felt his body responding to her words. It was a strange feeling, as if he were fighting his own principles on one hand, while being drawn by an unstoppable curiosity on the other. He didn't know what to do. Should he stop? Should he step back? Or should he simply give in to the situation? The decision seemed impossible, and yet he knew deep down that he couldn't continue as if nothing had happened. "You're so innocent, Hugga," Lyra said, looking at him again with her hypnotic eyes. "Everyone has dark sides, hidden desires, and I think you're finally ready to uncover them. You don't need to be afraid to come with me." Her words had a power that Hugga could barely comprehend. It was as if she was opening his eyes, showing him something he had never seen before, a world of possibilities beyond his imagination. "Maybe you're right," Hugga finally said as he moved away from her and leaned back. "Maybe all these years, I've just been looking away from myself. But I don't know if I can." But Lyra interrupted him with a smile that was both calming and challenging. "You don't know yet, Hugga, but you will. When the moment comes, you'll see that life is much more exciting when you truly live it. He had seen too much, experienced too much, and his years in the army had taught him a caution that now almost drove him crazy. "Do you want me to just let go?" Hoga asked, straightening up, but his eyes still couldn't tear themselves away from her body, which was dangerously close to him again. She slowly nodded, not taking her eyes off him. "Exactly," she whispered. "You have to let go, Hoga. It's the only way to understand the truth. You've been hiding from life for too long, from what you really want." Her words penetrated him, as if they were wiping away all his uncertainty, all his hesitation. And somehow, almost as if by an inner compulsion, he felt himself approaching the truth. But what was this truth? Was it really what he wanted? Or was it just a distraction that would lead him into an even greater trap? "Are you crazy, Lyra?" he finally said, his voice trembling slightly as he felt her closeness. "Do you really want to drag me into the story, don't you?" Lyra smiled, and in her eyes was a mix of mischief and knowledge. "Why do you think this is a story, Hoga? This isn't a game. This is the life you've missed because you were afraid to truly open up." Her words hit the mark, and Hoga felt something change within him. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had always lived in fear of change, fear of what he truly wanted. But right now, in this moment, he could no longer ignore it. Something in him was burning, a desire he had never allowed to arise. And Lyra, with her relentless determination, seemed to be the only one guiding him into this new, unknown territory. "So you're a seductress, huh?" Hoga asked, his voice now a little bolder as he tried to shift the conversation. "Are you trying to lure me out of my safe harbor?" Lyra laughed again. Her eyes sparkled with an almost dangerous light. "Maybe," she replied, "but you have it in you, Hoga. You have more courage than you think, and maybe that's exactly what you need to truly live." Her voice was almost like a command, but not in the harsh way he was used to from commanders. It was a soft, seductive voice, yet filled with a strange, unspoken authority. "I don't know if I can trust you, Lyra," Hoga admitted, trying to organize his thoughts. "What if this is just a trick? What if you're trying to trap me?" Lyra took a step closer. Her eyes were just millimeters from his. "That's the point, Hoga," she said calmly. "You don't trust me, but you need to, because the only trap you'll fall into is the one you've set for yourself." She looked him straight in the eyes, as if she could penetrate him, as if she could read his deepest secrets. And suddenly, everything became quiet. Hoga felt a knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't fear he was feeling. It was something else, a spark of interest he had never expected. I don't know what you want from me," Hoga finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "But maybe it's time to find out."